Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today is Quin Hilyer. He is a long-time conservative columnist. He is currently with the New Orleans Picayune, and he'll be joining us to discuss some of the recent controversies rocking the conservative road. The scandal involving the Heritage Foundation and also extending to now other conservative organizations such as the ISI, the alleged civil war inside the MAGA camp, and also, in more general terms, the future direction of the conservative movement as such. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you. So, just to get started, we are seeing what appears to be a capture of long-term classical liberal and conservative institutions by a more populist or far-right group of activists, operatives, and thinkers. How did this come about? Is it an unexpected development? Did it take place suddenly or is it something that was building up over time?
This has been building up over time. Some of us foresaw it 10 years ago. The rise of Donald Trump helped legitimize a lot of hangers on from
Mm-hmm.
Donald Trump or of Donald Trump who were not conservatives in any way at all, certainly not in the classical liberal tradition, which is uh, sort of where the conservatism grew out of. Instead, they were and are haters. They are uh, the other form of far right, which is not actually conservative, but is more fascist in leaning. They are for centralized control, and they are for uh, certainly not the traditional values of the American Republican experiment and small r Republican. And it was obvious they were there from the start of the Donald Trump effort, and they have only gotten more and more bold over the last 10 years.
Now, none of this is particularly new. For instance, Donald Trump himself was not originally a conservative. He was a Democrat who opposed Reagan on tariffs and other issues. But at the same time, there is now a video circulating of Donald Trump years ago criticizing Pat Buchanan for being anti-Semitic, racist, and so forth. How did it come about that somehow Donald Trump, the pro-tariff, big government guy, insinuated himself as the most conservative candidate in the 2016 election? At least that's how he sold himself to his supporters. And how how did it come that many of the institutions that came to support Trump over time, rather than rejecting Pat Buchanan and his views, are now pushing for him to get the Presidential Medal of Freedom and essentially adopting all of Buchanan's points? Were these people like that all along, or did they somehow mm, manage to misconstrue or misrepresent Trump's view on this issue? What is going on here?
Well, Trump certainly was never seen by longtime conservatives as the most conservative person in the race. There were others like Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio and Rick Santorum, who were more classically thought of as part of the conservative movement. But he was seen as somebody who was uh, sort of old right. He was very much in the Buchanan mode, except for Buchanan's fairly obvious anti-Semitism. Trump, to his credit, other than a few remarks that were not exactly the best about Jews counting his money, but other than that, He's never really been seen as anti-Semitic. He has a Jewish son-in-law, so he did not share Buchanan's sort of incipient anti-Semitism, but he was very much with Buchanan on a lot of the populist stuff. He was very much with Buchanan against illegal immigration. In fact, against immigration in general. He was very much with Buchanan on tariffs and trade, and that's the way that he set himself up as a different sort of conservative, not the modern Bill Buckley, Ronald Reagan, Jack Kemp conservative, but the old right that was more sort of anti-modernity, uh, anti-immigrant, anti really traditional classical liberalism values that go back to James Madison. He was part of that Buchanan camp, except for the anti-Semitism, if that makes sense.
Um, At one point, Trump's populism fed into a lot of what we were hearing on the conservative radio. Essentially, there was this sort of wave of fear-mongering, whether legitimate or not is an open question, concerning assorted issues ranging from the Democrats and their policies to illegal immigration to essentially the so-called globalists. And after 8 years of Obama, the public seemed to be primed to go into a sort of different direction, and yet even those who saw this wave of anger at some of what Obama did may have been quite surprised by how quickly Trump was embraced and how many of the former staunch critics of the Trumpian populism turned and embraced that sort of thing. Um, how did that happen?
Part of it is Trump's money. Look, Trump started
Hmm.
planting the seeds of his ascension within the Republican Party and the conservative movement by figuring that that's where the suckers were. The populist right showed in the case of Buchanan and also in the case of Ross Perot, who was sort of center right, that they had large numbers. They weren't by any means a majority, but they had very large numbers, and he figured he could mobilize them and then buy off the conservative organizations that were maybe having a hard time keeping their mojo going. And so he started donating money to conservative organizations right and left, and they said, okay, well, here's a rich guy who is now saying that he's conservative, even though he wasn't always. And they started welcoming him to their events, and he insinuated himself that way. And it's not that they were necessarily directly bought off, but it was
Hmm.
sort of a process over some years where they started seeing him as, okay, well, maybe he might be one of us. Money talks like that in sometimes in subtle ways, even if it's not direct corruption.
So how did people like Kevin Roberts end up being mainstreamed? Was it the issue of money that essentially Heritage was given donations to hire exactly somebody like him after was it because Roberts appears to be everywhere. He's not only the head directing Heritage now, but he's also a trustee for ISI, which has been pushing similar politics, also normalizing Tucker Carlson, Curtis Yarvin, and so forth. And he is also very much on the forefront of this um, a particular brand of Catholicism that seems to be embracing these sort of philosophies.
Yes, it's a weird in my mind, and I am a theology major from a Catholic university, although I'm not Catholic, but I'm married into a traditionalist Catholic family. Uh, it seems to me a very weird offshoot of Catholicism. It's not even really, sort of traditional pre-Vatican II
Hmm.
Catholicism. It's a weird offshoot of that, but it has gained a lot of currency, uh, unfortunately, in the last number of years. And maybe Roberts is part of that. But what happened at Heritage was they had a somebody who had come up in the Buckleyite Reaganite conservatism, Kay Cole James, lovely lady, might not have been the best fundraiser in the world, but otherwise philosophically thoughtful, sound. She was the president, and A, she wasn't as good at raising money apparently, and B, she was clearly not of the uh, Donald Trump populist angry right. She was a very sunny personality. And Tucker Carlson started attacking her, frankly, in quite racial terms. She happens to be a African American, a black lady. And and since Trump was in power and she was not in the in that mold, and she might not have been raising as much money. She was an easy target, and it was basically a Tucker Carlson led uh, insurgency toppled her from the head of the Heritage Foundation from being its president, and they went and they hired the most Trumpian head of a powerful state think tank that they could find, and that was Kevin Roberts, who I believe came from Texas, and installed him. Uh, and he took power, and unfortunately, the people that were on the Heritage Board, somehow the Heritage Board had, in my mind, gone bad, and they were no longer the same kinds of people that had led Heritage for the previous 40 years, 45 years. The people like Ed Fulner, who was a founder and the longtime president of it. Instead, they were more MAGA-like, and so they backed Kevin Roberts, and Kevin Roberts turned around and was like a lot of these weird offshoots of Catholicism. He was very pro Russia, pro Putin, pro Kremlin, anti Ukraine, and he uh, cracked the whip, and he basically said anybody at Heritage that is not on the Kremlin side but is on Ukraine's side, they needed to either silence themselves or get out. And and that was the first sign that this was something really, really not just different, but dangerously wrong. I'll stop
Now,
there for now.
now, the interesting thing about this whole MAGA movement is that it was originally Reagan's slogan, which he used very successfully to uh, to essentially become president after 4 disastrous years of Carter's term. But Reagan is exactly his policies were literally exactly the opposite of the MAGA movement now. He was anti-tariff, pro-global trade, and seeing U.S. as a strong economy and a leader. He was very much anti-communist, that's no secret, and very much anti-union as well, which Trump isn't. In fact, he has played unions to his favor, and on many other issues too. Reagan was what Trump now would call globalist. So it's very interesting that Trump, on the one hand, is attempting to use the Reagan's language and to compare himself to Reagan at every opportunity, but on the other hand, he's literally supporting everything that the Reagan MAGA movement stood for. Did no one who actually worked for Reagan catch on to the fact that this term was being hijacked for a completely ulterior purpose?
Well, I did, and I know a lot of others did. Look, I was there at the 1980 Republican National Convention when Reagan was nominated uh, for president the first time. I was a Reagan appointee to the Veterans Administration. I go way, way back as a Reaganite, and I still have my "Make America Great Again" button from Ronald Reagan, my lapel button. It's actually a pretty big one. And as soon as Trump started using that term, I started sort of shrieking about it. I thought it was an abomination because he does uh, stand against a lot of the things Reagan it was for and stand for a lot of the things Reagan is against. I do want to correct, if I can, very
Hmm.
respectfully, one thing. Reagan was not anti-union because he was a six-term president of a union, the
Hmm.
Screen Actors Guild. He was against, uh, he was not for public sector unions,
Hmm.
and he was against a lot of the things that
Hmm.
some of the unions did, but he wasn't against unions per se, and he actually enjoyed strong union support
Hmm.
uh, from the Teamsters, and he sort of allied himself in uh, or they the even the AFL-CIO under Meany was an anti-communist union. They were
Hmm.
very liberal domestically, but they were anti-communist, and so he would deal with them even when he opposed some of their policies. So it's a mixed bag on that front, but everything else you said is absolutely right, and I think it's an abomination that Trump stole the slogan and sort of tried to steal the Reaganite mantle as long as it did him some good.
Now, interestingly enough, of course, the younger generation of conservatives who grew up after Reagan, one can't exactly blame them for not fully being aware of how things were back in the day. And quite frankly, a lot of them seem to be missing a good chunk of classical, philosophical and political education in general. But the older generation of people who were around, or at least were familiar enough with what was going on, surely they saw that you cannot implicitly support two exactly opposite movements at the same time and claim that they will both work equally well. How were people sold on essentially embracing the very things that made them conservative to begin with?
Well, first of all, uh, it was only for a brief time that Trump and his insiders really claimed to be heirs of Reagan, and
Mhm.
especially when Mike Pence got pushed out after he stood up for the Constitution and for decency. Mike Pence was very much a Reaganite. As soon as Mike Pence got pushed out, there was nobody left in Trump world who had any ties to Reagan. And that's when, or even slightly before then, a lot of the younger Trump supporters no longer even tried to pretend that they had anything to do with Reagan because Reagan meant nothing to them, and they started actually mocking older conservatives, Reagan conservatives, as pushing what they called zombie Reaganism, as if the as if because the times had changed, we are 40 and 50 years after Reagan was rising and then at his heyday, uh, as if the principles change. You can change application of principles, the exact policies,
Hmm.
but but uh, but they were suggesting that the principles themselves should
Hmm.
change. Well, if you want to change the principles, you should no longer call yourself a conservative, because conservatism is not about specific policies. It's about abiding principles. And these people that now call themselves conservative, but think of Reaganism as passe, well, then they're not conservatives at all. They're something entirely different. And in this case, they have embraced, a lot of them have embraced anger, hatred, and certainly nothing that is in the Madisonian tradition of limited government. They are power hungry and for centralized power, which is the exact antithesis of James Madison and of Ronald Reagan.
I am particularly fascinated by the faith-based blocs who've supported Trump not only after his personal life predilections, all right, we can say nobody's perfect, but the fact that he has in fact, embraced outright criminality, from his dealings with Russian oligarchs in his business life to his pardons of various assorted convicted felons, including former Democrats, and um, erasure of what is seen as the rule of law. That to me is very mysterious because it seems to go against any sort of religious tradition, however you define it, and yet there seems to be a complete silence on that front. I can sort of understand overlooking someone's personal decisions for the sake of good policies, but we're seeing that that Trump's poor judgment is not limited to his personal life. It is literally affecting every aspect of governance and policy. So what can we say about these faith-based blocs and leaders from various traditions? I am not singling out Christianity by any means because we see that I have seen it with every religious movement. And their continuing support and silence over these issues, which are not just minor indiscretions. We are talking about very serious um, changes that include lifting anti-corruption laws for in the private sector and pardoning assorted frauds and so forth.
You're absolutely right. Is it Irina or
Yes. Hmm.
Irina? You're absolutely right. And there is a large degree of hypocrisy involved. Uh, when those on the left had major personal failings, the religious right leaders pointed to those failings as disqualifying, completely apart from policy. They said that the failings themselves were
Hmm.
disqualifying. Now that Trump has those failings and frankly worse, they say, well, that those either those were in the past or they don't really matter, or they just lie and say and say, well, nobody's proved those failings, even though it's quite obvious that they're true. But they say, oh no, what matters is he's defeating the left. So what has changed is they're saying what actually matters. They used to say the failings themselves matter. Now they say it's the ultimate goals that matter and the policies that come out of it. And then sometimes when even the policies don't fit, but they're still beating the bad guys, well, then the enemy of my enemy, they say, is my friend, even though they're not really a friend. And Trump is not really their friend at all. They pretend that Trump somehow himself is a man of deep faith when that is so obviously false. They lie to themselves and then they start lying to others. And again, in the end, it's a bad form of hypocrisy. But they like the closeness to power, and they let power corrupt their judgment, and that's a bad thing.
Well, I don't mean to bring up Nietzsche at an already dark moment, but as the saying goes, you stare at the abyss long enough, it stares back at you. Basically, it's one thing to claim you want to beat the left, but these people literally becoming the left, not just in terms of the means by which they ascend to power, but also in terms of actual policies. The only meaningful distinction at this point between the Democrats and the Republicans at various points in time is the opposition to the transgender policies and the like. Everything short of that, I think, at some point has actually embraced various progressive policies and institutional thinking, not to mention, as I said, the methods that the right has traditionally criticized, the really cynical power fixated march through the institutions. So is there now any quote unquote right left ideologically speaking?
Well, there's still some clear distinctions where Trump's policies, if not the means that he uses to get them, are more identifiably conservative than liberal. It's not just on things like transgender and w all the forms of woke ideology, whether race or sex or gender, uh, those kind of things. Clearly, Trump is on the more traditionally conservative side in terms of policy. But on income tax rates, he is on the
Mhm.
more traditionally conservative side. Uh, on on deregulation, his policies are on the traditionally conservative uh, in terms of wanting to deregulate vast swaths of the federal apparatus. But that said, you're absolutely right. The means that he uses are clearly leftist means. The centralization of power is traditionally leftist. The uh, willingness to run roughshod over the Constitution is clearly out of the left, not out of the right. And we could go on. You are, you know, for about 75% of what Trump does, it's either left or not clearly conservative. For about 85% or 90%, the means that he uses are clearly more out of the left than the right, and it's very disturbing.
We have seen that, all of these issues, while they've been hotly debated internally and externally, seem to have come to a head since Charlie Kirk's assassination, um, and the consequent months to follow. Whatever one thinks of Kirk himself, his death very much played into the hands of the extremists within the MAGA movement, who've tried to use it to accelerate their apocalyptical rhetoric and essentially to advance the ascent of extremely radical personalities to the takeover of the remainder of the takeover of the turning point. It was already heading in a disturbing direction even before that, and we saw the culmination of that, sort of a litmus test, in Tucker Carlson's interview with Nick Fuentes, who was not even Carlson's personal associate. They've had personal issues between them, and Kevin Roberts' embrace of that interview and of Tucker Carlson, and to this day he's not, despite apologies and walking back assorted rhetoric, he has not fully distanced himself from the ideology behind all of that. It's one thing to say, well, we won't invite Tucker anymore, and completely different to say, I reject everything Carlson and his ilk stand for, which has not been said by Roberts or anyone else who's currently leading Heritage at the top level and has not yet resigned. So, would you say that this litmus test, let me put it this way, did Carlson go too far in trying to push these narratives in embracing Fuentes, or was it the plan all along to cause this sort of fracture within MAGA itself, not to mention the general conservative movement? Would Carlson have been better off with a more incrementalist approach, or did he embrace an opportunity, and was this something that will actually accelerate the demise of traditional conservatism?
A lot of us don't know what happened to Tucker. He seemed like an entirely different person 30 years ago. Uh, but he has worked incrementally for the last 10 years
Mhm.
to move over to this extremist, bigoted, hateful sort of ideology. But it was slow. I was amazed because I had liked Tucker. I've known Tucker for a long time. I was amazed when he started doing and saying some of the things he did and said in 2016, 17, 18, and when he did, frankly, what were to me clearly racist attacks on K. Cole James at Heritage. I called him out on it in some of my columns, and then I called him out in three or four different columns, and I didn't know where he was going or what he was doing. I didn't know whether There were momentary lapses, but now it's clear he has been pushing for this for these last 10 years. Uh, he is openly embracing what can only be called anti-Semitism. He is openly embracing uh, radicalism and sort of various forms of old left ideology. He's, radically pro-Russia, pro-Kremlin, pro-Putin. Uh, he's, to me, he comes across as racist in lots of ways. And I don't know whether he was like that all along and had us fooled for 20, 25 years, or whether something happened to him 10 years ago and he started to go bad. I just don't know. You started asking about Charlie Kirk, and that what happened to Charlie Kirk was an abomination. Our hearts go out to his wife, Erica, to his children, to his friends. It was an act of pure evil. But that said, the way that the right, and especially the extremist right, has used, and you use different words, but this is basically what you said, and you're right about it, has used his death as a rallying call for extremism and as a rallying call for attacking anybody left of center, and saying that the entire left of center world is a they who killed Charlie Kirk and therefore they must be punished. What they're doing is ghoulish, Ghoulish. It is ghoulish. It is disgusting. It is evil, and it frankly dishonors Charlie Kirk himself, who I'm not saying was a saint, but there were some things that he did stand for that that would make him appalled at the things that are being done in his name, and it really should stop.
So back in the day, William F. Buckley kicked out this sort of people like the John Birch Society out of the conservative movement, and quite frankly, at Bob Dole's nomination, he too condemned these sorts of people and made it very clear that he wouldn't tolerate them, if he were to lead the party. Today, it's not clear who's leading the conservative movement. Trump is very clearly the party leader as the president, and also because he literally has gained control of the institutions. But is there a clear classical liberal, classical conservative leader who is not, just a politician doing his job in the Senate or whatever, but someone who is an intellectual leader in the movement outside the MAGA camp? Do we have such people, or do we have just simply individual public intellectuals doing their own thing? Is there is there a cohesive, united movement to oppose MAGA?
Unfortunately, no, and there needs to be one. Some have tried and failed. Uh, Clearly, Mike Pence has tried to hold to his ideals and his principles. And I have to say this, a lot of people said, well, why did Pence sell out to Trump so much? No, what Mike Pence did as vice president for 4 years was heroic because he kept the first Trump administration from going entirely off the rails. He was a wise Reaganite voice for 4 years, and the people he put in place were the ones that actually accomplished the Reaganite conservative things. Not that there were too many of them, but the Reaganite conservative things that were accomplished under Trump were accomplished by Pence and his people.
Mhm.
Uh, Pence is now talking about running for president in 2028. I don't know if he's got the charisma to do it, but he is a man of high ideals and of Reaganite ideals. But is he the leader of the national conservative movement? No. Unfortunately, we have no recognized such leader. Another person who has stayed true to her principles and who is very clearly a Reaganite is Liz Cheney. My condolences to her for the death of her wonderful father, who was a really good and decent and kind man, by the way. Uh, but she has just been viciously attacked by the MAGAites and has been made a pariah. There are people sort of in the conservative journalism world, Jonah Goldberg, Ramesh Ponnuru, for whatever I'm worth, I've tried, Matt K. Lewis, and some others who have tried to keep the Reaganite flag and the flag of Jack Kemp, the openness, the decency, the upbeat, positive view of what can be accomplished. We've tried to hold that flag aloft, but we're not a national leader like Ronald Reagan was. We need to find not just a leader, but somehow cohere the movement again, and maybe even join with those of the center and the responsible center left to bring things back to what was the American mainstream. And then we can certainly push for conservative policies within that mainstream, but we need to unite to defeat both the far left and the MAGA right.
I'm going to be a little bit provocative here. Reagan
Okay.
succeeded, with that message of optimism because he showed that practically speaking, you can win elections and get to power and accomplish whatever you want while doing all of these things. Trump's message to the public, which everyone came to believe, is that due to the radicalization within the Democratic Party and its infiltration with assorted other types of people, that is no longer possible in today's day and age. That you need this anger, you need this fear mongering, and you certainly need the Tucker Carlson type of people to get to power. And first, my question is it true? And how do you disavow people of the notion that this is the only path to political success? And second, given how many of these types of characters proliferated, even if we had leadership that was dedicated to restoring conservatism as it originally was, would they even be able to get rid of so many people given how much influence they currently have?
Great question. I have felt like I'm beating my head against the wall for 10 years, trying to convince people that it is not just possible, but actually easier to win that way. Reagan won 44 states in 1980. He won 49 states in 1984 by being, he talked tough, but he still had a sunny, upbeat vision, and he did not do take low blows against his opponents, et cetera, et cetera. And that way can win. It is the biggest myth out there among young so-called conservatives, young MAGAites, and frankly, some older ones, that the reason that Bob Dole, John McCain, and Mitt Romney lost was that they were too nice. That's absolutely nonsense. First of all, Bob Dole was the guy known in 1976 as Gerald Ford's hatchet man in that campaign. He knew how to slash and burn when he had to. He was not a mean person, but he could do some tough politics. John McCain, I mean, he was as irascible as they got. But again, he knew how to play political hardball when he needed to. Mitt Romney, you should talk to the his Republican opponents from 2008 and 2012 about whether his team played hardball or not. Uh, so it's not that they were too nice, although they at least had some decency to them. But they didn't lose because they were too nice. They lost because of lots of other reasons, which I could take an hour going into.
Mhm.
But they were not like powder puff people. They were all three of them were very tough campaigners and could slash and burn with the rest of them when needed to. But it didn't take it's not that Trump was mean that made him win.
Hmm.
It's that he had some very, very weak opponents, number one, and
Hmm.
he just relentlessly hammered their weaknesses. But it wouldn't have worked against opponents that weren't as weak. But frankly, you could have beaten Hillary Clinton. You could have beaten Joe Biden in 24. Uh, Much easier by much bigger margins and gotten more than 50% of the vote had you not done divide and conquer, but attract and add. Trump won very, very narrow pluralities of well, once of the popular vote. The first time he didn't even win a plurality of the popular vote, but he won a very narrow majority of the electoral vote. Uh, but he could have won bigger if he had been more upbeat, if he had not said everybody that's not with him is an absolute enemy that needs to be trampled. I beg for the day when we can show again that a Reagan-esque upbeat approach can win. All we need is a candidate that frankly can get through the Republican primaries and win the Republican nomination and then run the right kind of campaign.
And that leads me
Sorry,
to
I'm
the
so long-winded, by the way. I hope that's not too long-winded, but
not at all. That actually leads me straight to the other question. Assuming such a personality can ever win elections, how would such a conservative leader or conservative president would they be able to get rid of a lot of these Buchananites, assorted just trolls, and all these other noxious personalities that are polluting the moment, and adding nothing but divisions and polarization and fanaticism to politics.
but again, to repeat, how do you do it? Is that what you're asking?
Is it even possible at this point? Because they
Oh,
seem
is
to
it
be
possible?
everywhere.
Yes, yes, it's possible. Is it possible easily in the short run? No.
Hmm.
Is it possible with hard work and in the slightly longer run? Yes. Uh, I am an eternal optimist, and uh, just because one way, which by the way is a very wrong and even borderline evil way, has worked for 10 years, doesn't mean that it's the only thing that can work. Uh, I think all I'm not necessarily a believer that the man makes a movement because you have to have a movement around him, but there are times when the movement needs a man or a woman,
Hmm.
and And right now, we do need somebody with a big personality, but that is a big personality with a different approach, a sunnier, a more optimistic, a friendlier approach. But if somebody emerges that can catch the public imagination, uh, just like when Trump caught a part of the public's imagination with his angry personality. If you get somebody with just as big a personality, but it's a personality that's upbeat and friendly uh, and frankly decent, uh, that can turn the tide rather quickly.
So that leads me to a couple of questions that are related to the direction of the conservative movement and Republican Party. Not that the two are the same, but both are equally affected by these factors. And one is we are seeing very strange lines of thought like that emerging from Curtis Yarvin, monarchic, anti-democratic thoughts penetrating into the philosophical mainstream and um, essentially helping advance a post-liberal line of thought that's very comfortable with various increasingly strange forms of authoritarianism. And it's not just Trump, pretending to be king. You could excuse it as his personal narcissism. We're seeing that seep on a very mainstream level. To what extent, is it simply a failure of ideological vigilance by the right, or is this a birth of a genuine new direction that is reconciling, that doesn't pretend to reconcile hierarchy with democracy and is simply moving us towards a banana republic type of structure?
Unfortunately, it's the latter. It's a very real movement. It's very dangerous. This Curtis Yarvin guy is profoundly dangerous. He has a disciple in Vice President J.D. Vance who actually cites him as one of his intellectual mentors, and that's very dangerous. Again, it's connected to this weird offshoot of Catholicism that we talked about earlier, but it's very authoritarian. It's openly dismissive of the Constitution if the Constitution gets in the way of their power. Uh, and it is tremendously anti-American. It's completely against the American tradition. And let's talk about some labels here because both of us have gone back and forth, and I've done it too, talking
Mhm,
about classical liberalism and conservatism. And people say, wait, conservatism and liberalism are
mhm.
opposites. Why are you citing classical liberalism? And there is a problem in terminology that confuses a lot of people. Classical liberalism is what modern William F. Buckley, Ronald Reagan conservatives want to conserve. What
Mhm.
we conserve is the classical liberalism, as it was called at the time, that the American founders believed in. It was liberal as opposed to the monarchies and to the authoritarians. It was not liberal in the modern sense of big government. Classical liberalism was Madison's balance of powers, his work to make sure that no branch of government and no individual person had too much power amassed in any one area. But that the reason government is there is not to impose its will, but to protect individual liberty. And to protect individual liberty is what classical liberalism is meant. That's where that name came from. Modern conservatives would conserve classical liberalism. Curtis Yarvin, J.D. Vance, much of the MAGA movement openly detests classical liberalism in favor of a new form of authoritarianism. And that is why we can say that they're both anti-classical liberalism and anti-modern conservatism. They are an entirely new, different, and dangerous thing.
Leads me to the other factor in this equation, which is Saul Alinsky. In circa 2016, I saw very much Reaganite Republicans who detested what Trump was selling start shifting their thinking and embracing Alinsky as as a way to essentially mirror the left's tactics, the march through their institutions. But rather than applying his methods while advancing classical liberal policies, they seem to have taken all of Alinsky all together, and these institutions were captured not with traditional conservative values, but with exactly the opposite. So we see in this Alinsky's procedural radicalism that has become a method of choice and not simply one of the potential methods by this
Oops.
core of activists and operatives. Um, do you think that it was inevitable that such an approach would result in a movement that believes that the revolutionary destructions of norms is a moral act? This draining of swamp should start with burning down what these classical institutions and essentially destroying everything in order to rebuild, supposedly.
Irina, you are so on target. You're 100% on target. Look, uh, back in 2013, I wrote a column called Saul Alinsky Takes the White, no, excuse me, 2009. Saul Alinsky Takes the White House, and it was about how how Barack Obama was using the methods of Saul Alinsky. And I was not the only one, certainly, but one of the ones who popularized uh, the awareness that we were fighting Alinskyites and that they must be fought, and that this was what was driving the Obamite left. But the point was not just that Alinsky's ends, that his goals were bad. Our point, my point certainly, was that Alinsky's methods themselves were bad. The means that he used was bad. In fact, not just bad, but evil. And conservatives had to oppose both his ends and his means. And instead, and I said this in 2015 and 16, Trump, rather than opposing the means and ends of Alinsky, he absolutely adopted Alinsky's methods, those evil methods, dividing, conquering, lying, cheating, stealing, doing whatever it took to amass power. And that is profoundly un-Republican, un-American, un-Republican in the smaller meaning of Republican, and it is wrong and it must not be accepted. And we could take a whole hour explaining why
Mhm.
Alinsky's methods themselves are evil. We have to oppose them. The means for reestablishing good government, decent government in the American tradition have to be American means. They have to be constitutional means. Those means absolutely work. Reagan proved that they worked. Despite his flaws, Gingrich proved in the 90s that they worked when I was there on the Appropriations Committee with Congressman Bob Livingston and we balanced the budget. Uh, those methods will work if you give them a chance, if you have patience, and if you have character. Uh, I was absolutely appalled to hear, including some people that I thought were old Reaganites in 2015 and 2016, say they repeated this phrase to me again and again. They said, burn it down, burn it all down. Well, there is no such thing as a conservative who wants to burn everything down. Conservatives are about building up. And when I heard friends of mine that I thought were classical, you know, were Reagan conservatives saying burn it all down, that's when I realized we are in big, big trouble. And we're still in trouble. We're in even worse trouble, but never, ever give up because you know, things were really, really bad in the late 1970s, and the conservative movement and Ronald Reagan turned things around, and it can be done again.
No, last question, since I know you have to run quickly. People like Roberts and Carlson, they may very well see that the fusion of establishment power and populist provocation as sustainable. But is it is it really, or is it inherently unstable, and the strategy is destined to implode under the weight of its own contradictions?
Almost all revolutions uh, either implode or explode uh, unless they are run by and in the spirit uh, of something constructive and and something that is not itself radical. The American Revolution was run by what we would now know know as conservatives, but they were not in any way, with the exception maybe of pamphleteer Thomas Paine, they were not radicals and they were not trying to burn anything down. They were trying to stand up for what they thought was already part of their British heritage. And they thought that that heritage had been denied them. They were not trying to burn down society, they were trying to build it up. That's the only kind of revolution in the long run that can succeed. Every revolution that is radical in nature and radical in aims is likely to either implode on itself or explode in a fiery furnace. And either way, its progenitors end up getting burned to a crisp.
Finally, at the heart of
Figuratively speaking, that is.
right. Well, who knows with some of these people. At the heart of populism, there's this idea of a power struggle between the people, the common people, and the elites. But Trump and his supporters have become the new elites. First of all, they're literally holding political power. Second, many of them are very wealthy. And third, they're increasingly consolidating power that was not even part of their political or business or business reach. They're consolidating power from in every aspect of the sphere, and we are seeing that there is quite a great deal of overreach. We're seeing parties at Mar-a-Lago while the tariffs are squeezing the middle class and the middle of the country, and a lot of the blue collar workers and farmers and all these people who were part of Trump's core group of supporters, they are being affected by the economic policies, while these same people are living it up, spending huge amounts of money on rebuilding the White House, um, on um, traveling and buying up new fleets like Christy Nome and so forth. How is this going to end? At what point do people wake up and realize that they were misled into actually perpetuating the same types of elites that are even more brazen than the ones they deposed?
I think it's already started to happen. You saw that with the elections this month, where it wasn't just that Democrats won in Democratic leaning jurisdictions. It's how big they won. That was a sign that the middle is again getting very frustrated uh, with those in power. And the more that those in power live it up, they gild the lily, they live it up, they knock down the east wing of the White House, they turn everything into this disgusting, showy, fake gold. Uh, they buy their fleets, as you say. People will resent that. And as long as we have free elections, as long as the MAGAites don't actually figure out a way to hijack elections that are not close, then the American political system will work a sort of rough justice and will throw these bums out on their ears. I just hope that the Democrats put up moderates so that when the current bums get thrown out, that we have people that are at least semi-responsible rather than these far left crazies like Mamdani in New York.
Is there then a future for the Republican Party in 2028 to put up candidates who are not tied to Trump and his successes and who are more of a traditional brand, or is it something that will take years to fix?
Uh, that's a very good question. I don't know the answer. Is it possible that in 2028, somebody decent and not MAGA can win? Yes. Is it likely? I don't know. A lot depends on what happens in the 2026 elections, depends on how badly Republicans lose in 2026 and
Mhm.
whether if they lose big in 2026, whether that uh, uh, means that enough people finally wake up that they throw out all the Trumpites on their ear. I don't know yet, but we have to act as if A,
Mhm.
We meaning old, decent, traditional Reagan conservatives. We have to act as if we can win in 28, but we also have to be prepared for the long haul if we don't. We cannot let the flame of liberty die, no matter how long it takes. And unfortunately, my time is up. I'm going to have to end on that. But you have asked wonderful questions. I've really enjoyed being on your show. Your questions come from a place of great knowledge and judgment, and it's a rare pleasure to be interviewed by somebody that does that. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It was a great pleasure to have you here, and I hope we'll stay in touch. And I hope we'll next time we talk, things will be in a much better place for everyone. Thanks to
Wonderful.
everyone.
Please, and please send me a link when it's up.
Absolutely. For everyone
Thank
watching
you.
the program, we'll be back next Tuesday night, 9 p.m. The Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Goodbye.